Today, I am really excited to have with me a very dear friend of mine, one of my oldest and dearest friends. Her name's Melissa. She's my neighbor. We've known each other a long time. She and her husband were very, very good friends with my husband and I. And Melissa and Kevin happened to be the first people that I reached out to and called the night that my husband passed away, and I needed some comfort and help. And they were right there for me, and they have continued to be there for me. And we're doing this particular podcast for Father's Day, and Melissa especially has a great experience to share about her life and relationship with her father, and the things that she came to learn and understand about how the teachings of Christ affect our relationships and then ultimately how we grieve. So I've asked her to share that experience. And Melissa, could you start by just introducing yourself?
Yeah, thanks, Julie. I'm feeling, as you're introducing me and just reflecting on our friendship, it does make me a little emotional. So hopefully I can swallow that and just have a good conversation. But so my name is Melissa. I have 4 kids. I'm married to my husband, Kevin. I've got 2 kids that are college age and one in high school, and then one actually heading to high school this year. So 2 kids kind of in and out of the house and 2 still at home. We have lived where we have for about 14 years and been neighbors with Julie in all that time. So I grew up generally in the Utah area, kind of all about the state. We lived growing up, we moved a lot, which definitely impacted the way I see the world and my life experiences, and elements of my relationship with my dad. I have 4 siblings as well. My parents divorced when I was a young mom. I was 25. And so my parents have been divorced 20, I guess about 20 years now.
Wow.
So a lot of that, also plays into relationship.
Did that surprise you?
No, that they divorced.
Mm-hmm.
I wasn't necessarily surprised they divorced. My parents had, turmoil in their marriage for a good part of my life. I think the significant elements started when I was about 10. At least my remembrance. I think, as I looked back, there were little things that I probably noticed as a child, which is interesting, stressor points that I picked up on. But we rode this long wave of ups and downs through our childhood and young adulthood, really. And then when we were all out of the house is when my mom decided to end the marriage. And so, yeah, we were kind of older teenager to young adult age when they divorced. And then my dad remarried twice after that. And both times, like, the women were lovely and felt like a blessing and a nice addition to our lives to kind of help bridge some of those relationship gaps that were a struggle. So the remarrying was a blessing, it felt like.
Right.
What else about me? I don't know. Is there anything else you want to know that helps?
Well, I think that's a pretty good picture. You're a pretty typical mom.
Yeah, pretty typical mom. 4
Yeah.
kids, marriage.
Your hairstylist.
I'm a hairstylist. The last 4 years, I've worked as a school administrator in a private school, and then carry responsibilities within the church I belong to. So
you're a great cook.
I like to cook. I like to bake. I enjoy exercise. I like to run. I like distance running, biking. So
yeah, you're just a fun, lovely, approachable person.
Thank you. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you.
So now tell me a little bit more about your dad.
Yeah. So my dad, he's a funny guy. He's a funny guy. So how I always describe him is like, he's the guy who will be your best friend in the line at the water slide.
Okay.
Like which is a true experience. Like that's a true story, which
That's
is
so
why I
funny.
kind of like draw on that sometimes. So he's very charismatic, like a great storyteller. Sometimes you're like, are these stories true or not true? Sometimes
Okay.
not, sometimes yes. But very friendly, very approachable. So like literally you would be standing in line of an amusement park or at a water slide and he would just know how to like engage a person to get to know them. Suddenly you would know about him. And by the time you made it to the bottom, you're like, we are friends,
Yeah.
So
So just a
that is my dad.
fun guy, huh?
He was a fun guy.
What was
He
he like
kind
as a
of
dad?
as a dad, I would say like he was a fun dad. We kind of describe him as like a Disneyland dad. He didn't parent us in a way that like gave us a lot of like discipline or structure. If
Okay.
we were to be in trouble, it was certainly by my mom.
Okay.
And so he just liked to provide the fun and entertainment. He worked hard. He jumped jobs quite often, which I think just an element of his personality, kind of unsettled, always looking for that next best thing.
Mm.
And I think a lot of people, and this has really taken like reflection since his passing, because something I've definitely learned is that in my experience, there's something about someone passing, and I think it's a great blessing that we start to reanalyze who we thought they were.
Uh-huh.
And I think it's like a gift that God gives us to kind of maybe see elements, even things that are maybe negative, and find like, there's some good in that. So, for instance, my dad changing jobs a lot, which led to us moving a lot, which was a huge, could be a huge life stressor.
Especially on your mom, I imagine.
Huge on my mom. I mean, sometimes it was like 6 months here and then we're going to move to another house 6 months later. And you imagine 4 kids
Oh,
trying to
man.
get them back into school and, all the things that go with that.
Yeah.
And then from a child standpoint, like always trying to make your new best friend, right?
Right.
And so friendship to me is like very valuable because I was always seeking friendship as I moved so much. So, but for my dad, I think there's things that could be definitely viewed as like negative as far as like his career and how he would show up in the world in that way.
Uh-huh.
And yet, maybe sometimes like the mortgage wasn't paid, but he would take us to Disneyland. And and you could really juggle like, okay, is that appropriate? And a lot would
Right.
say no, but I'm like, but when it came down to it, the heart of him wanted to provide something for his children, like wanted an experience with his family. And maybe the more responsible thing is to make sure your mortgage was paid or the bills were paid or whatever. And yet I'm like, but those are core memories, like when
Right.
we
Yeah.
back on our childhood, like we remember our dad taking us to Disneyland,
Right. Right.
or
Right.
to San Francisco as teenagers to watch the 49ers play because we were all huge Steve Young fans,
Right.
like
Right.
core memories that I knew were a sacrifice. And so I've really come to realize like my dad's sacrifice, and it could be very selfish, right? Like there's so many angles you could look at this. Maybe he was self-serving, maybe it was a selfish element, and maybe both, but
To be the fun dad.
to be fun dad. But I'm like, there was still an element of sacrifice there.
Right. I mean, he was there. He was
He was
engaging with you.
there, right?
Yeah.
He was
Yeah.
there. And so, there were definitely actions and things in his life that pulled him from his family in a way,
Mm-hmm.
that brought an element of negativity to our life. And yet there were other things that, yeah, he was there trying to engage. And so
You know what it reminds me of? What's that movie with Robin Williams where he dresses as the maid for his kids so that he can spend
Oh, family
time
favorite. Like, yes.
Mrs. Doubtfire, right?
Mrs. Doubtfire, we watched a million times in our house growing up. Yes. Yes. Like he wanted to be there and a part of it so badly. And so, yeah. So overall, I would say and then also there's a part of him that is critical and never critical of us. I was just explaining this to someone the other day. It's interesting growing up with someone who's very critical of the world and people out there in the world,
Uh-huh. Uh-huh.
but not necessarily of his children. It was never aimed at us, which I also think is such an interesting blessing.
That is a big deal.
Isn't that interesting?
That's huge to think of somebody who has a critical eye, but not towards the most vulnerable people in his life.
Yeah. Isn't that interesting? He's the guy that's going to tell you how to drive and how to park and why would that person do that thing,
Uh-huh.
and upset about overpaying for a Jimmy John sandwich or whatever. But, so kind of quick and short that way, which can also be very hard to be around.
Mm-hmm.
So there was this balance of like this really fun loving guy, but also like very critical that was hard to be around. So
Right.
you kind of juggled these two.
He sounds a little bit like a boat on the water, and depending on
Yes,
the water, you would get
definitely. And, I think growing up, we would kind of discuss it as like the pride cycle, right? Like you would kind of just like go in this loop, depending on what was happening in life. And so, which I think we all do to some extent, right? As we're aligning our lives with God and feeling good about who we are and how we're showing up in the world, that's going to reflect in different things. And so,
right, and how we relate with others.
And how we relate with others.
You saw that with your dad, that when he was feeling good about his life and his choices, he was easier to be around. Or
yeah, and you could tell, you could like see this like this very visual, like almost like a shift in the face, presence, when he was making life choices that didn't align with who he really was. This countenance change.
right.
And in those times is when the more negative, the more critical person would show up. And so
I know that there was a time when you were where you were a little estranged from him. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah. So I think, growing up with, like I said, kind of these yearly cycles of um, life experiences that just would kind of always come back, right? Like smooth out, be good, come back. There was still this like negative undertone towards him. And it was kind of the attitude of like, he's causing some of the pain and discomfort in our family and our home. And so
in your extended, like with your siblings, you mean your extended family?
With our siblings, like we were all a very close knit group with our mom and our siblings, but it was kind of like us versus him. Which I think, can be very common under the circumstances. And, and of course I've like reflected back on, could that have been different? But I think that only comes from living life and self-reflection,
right.
Looking back on the past. But so because of that, it's so many years of kind of that heartbreak cycle. And like, there just were points where you're like, I just don't really like to be around you, and I'm kind of waiting for you to disappoint me again, or I don't want to put myself in this space of being hurt in this way. And so I think it was a lot of like just buildup of over time. But yeah, there were definitely years spent where I had a lot of anxiety around him and the idea of him. So if he would call, I would screen the calls until I could muster up enough, until the moment was right and I had enough to like engage in that conversation, whatever that might be. And because of this, like there wasn't a lot of depth because, he wasn't a father that I could go to for financial advice because I didn't
Right.
trust his judgment, or I didn't feel like I could go to him and like have gospel discussions because I wasn't sure that he really understood what that meant, because I was like, sometimes your life doesn't mimic what we believe,
Right.
And
Right.
so my relationship with him was very surface. We could talk about the weather. We could talk about
Which you
whatever
can't talk about for very
hobby,
long.
which you can't talk about for very long. We could engage in like some of his, current hobbies. I could always give him, current information about my kids, and that sort of thing. But it was like very shallow, very surface.
So this, okay, so that I'm understanding this picture of him, super fun dad, but also the same dad who's switching jobs a lot, you're moving a lot, so not a lot of stability.
Not a lot of
When
stability.
he's
No.
there, he's engaged, but then he's kind of disappearing, like emotionally for
Yeah.
time.
Yeah.
Okay. So then as
Yeah.
an adult, as you are creating this stability for your own family, and I mean, you married Kevin, who's like,
The
this
most
like,
stable.
yeah, that's right. That's right. So it's funny.
Default.
Isn't it funny how we choose very specific traits
Oh,
that are
yes.
sometimes exactly like our dad's or the exact opposite,
Yes.
based on how it affected us, right? So
Right.
here you are married to Steady Eddie, but
Yes.
relating to your dad as kind of this fun,
Oh, yeah.
wave of,
Wave.
okay,
Yeah. Yeah.
yeah. So I could imagine that, yeah, as as you get older and you're establishing your own family, that becomes less and less. You appreciate that little bit of craziness less and less.
Yeah.
Am I
Yeah.
understanding that right?
Yes, I'd say so. Um, and as far as like relationship and timing, so my dad did remarry after my parents divorced to a lady for about 5 years. And this is when my kids were really little, so she kind of became grandma in some shape or form
Mm-hmm.
for that time frame. And then they separated and divorced. And that was really hard. To kind of let someone into our life and my kids' life. That was the first time of letting someone on the outside in, to
Mm-hmm.
not just my life, but my children. And so when they divorced, we were kind of back to like, oh, now we have to just deal with him on our own, right? It was nice to have the buffer.
Right,
And so
right.
then fast forward, I don't remember the time
But then
frame.
for your children also, it's a loss because they are thinking of her as grandma.
Yeah, yeah. And luckily they
Right,
were young enough that it subsided. It was a pretty
right, right.
quick,
Well, okay, yeah, that
didn't
makes
affect
sense.
them really a lot, but it was more just the idea of it for me.
Right.
So then he was single for a little time and then married someone else at the same time that my mother was also remarrying. So I had two new marriages within a very short period of time, which
That's
was
a lot.
a lot.
Yeah.
That was a lot. And that could be a whole other episode. But
That's
so
true. Yeah, yeah.
this new lady
Of,
came in. Oh, sorry, I cut you off.
no, that's okay. You go ahead.
Yeah, so I was just gonna say, so this new lady came into the picture, who we love and adored, and she was just so wonderful, and they did really well together. And so it was like the first time we were kind of rebuilding and picking up this relationship of this is now his new life with this person, and so welcoming. She was so welcoming of us as
Mm.
grown children and our little kids. So it really became a grandma, grandpa scenario again. And so we really just kind of start to rebuild.
Mhm.
And then they went to serve a mission for the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. And it was in that time that I really kind of started to see some of my dad's downfalls more as like less of making choices to intentionally turn away from his family and more as these are his weaknesses And I really think stem from a self-esteem component, wanting validation in life, needing to feel love, and so trying to fill those needs with outsource, unhealthy ways. And so I started to have eyes to see that in a different way. And I think a big part of that is one, maybe growth and maturity on my part and my own adult journey. And I definitely think like the blessing of service and sacrifice that they were offering to God. And so it was in that time that I really started to see him in a different light and started to kind of open my eyes to new possibilities about who he was, and really opening my heart to him. And so when he came home, because they were gone, I think the 18 months or so, that our relationship really changed. Like I didn't have to block his calls anymore. I could just answer the phone and have a conversation and kind of welcome him into my world. And so, but still some boundaries, it was still a building, because I felt like so much had happened at a young age that some of that core relationship that you build and you lean on was never fully established. Like even as a young child, I think it was still kind of a surface level. And so that was a time frame that really started to shift. So that was about 10 years ago. But that's time and practice, right? So then,
Melissa, do you feel like before that time, do you feel like you judged him
yeah,
a little bit?
For sure.
Okay.
For sure.
So the judge,
because it was, if he would just do this, then
we could have a relationship. Right.
Yeah. Yeah. So it was all about, it was definitely a judgment for my part. And I give myself the grace. I try to have understanding around myself that, I did the best I could with what I knew. Right.
Yeah.
And my own circumstances and my own environment and my own teachings. And
you had your own hurts and you had a family that you were trying to raise.
Yeah. So, but definitely a judgment. And it's hard under those circumstances to not judge. Right. Because it sometimes feels pretty obvious. But, of course,
this is part of what I like about your story, though, is that it's really, really, it's so normal. And yet you have this really huge redemptive piece.
Yeah.
That I think you're going to talk about, which to me is so hopeful, right? That you can start out with some rough things. You can have a rough relationship, or not the relationship you wanted or might think was ideal, but then, as you come to appreciate and love him.
Yeah.
Through different eyes. Yeah. So speak to that. Yeah.
Yeah. So just to kind of add just a tiny bit more context is, so we were in this growing phase. And then turmoil kind of hit his current marriage again. And so that fell apart, and I was like, oh, here we go again. And so I felt even more protective, and I was trying to still be loving and understanding, but it was affecting my relationship with my sister because it affected her so deeply.
Right.
And she and I are so close, that I kind of felt like in a way I had to choose. If I try and keep this door open with him, that hurts her, and I choose her.
Right.
And so that was kind of a juggle that, she had, I guess if we're going to speak to loyalty, I was like, she had been loyal, our whole lives. She's younger than I am, but we've just been the best of friends our whole lives. And so, I was loyal to that relationship. And so if it meant choosing her to protect her, that's what I chose.
Right.
And so, so that was probably about 4 years ago. So then just kind of juggling, what does this look like? How do we do this? And, So where do you want me to go?
So then about 4 years ago, did you go back to this very surfacey,
Yeah,
superficial
kind of.
relationship with your dad?
Yeah, yeah. So he and his ex-wife reconciled to a place of friendship. So their lives were still, kind of commingled, did a lot together, still kind of traveled together, really good friends. But we were like, we don't really know what to do with. We didn't know how to handle that. We're like, so that's fine. That's how you're choosing to live your life. It's confusing to us. We love
Right.
you both, but we don't really know how we fit into this little weird dynamic you guys have.
Right.
And
Right.
so yeah, we were still kind of juggling that dual relationship. So I think it definitely went back surface. My heart was a little hardened again. I wasn't fully out of it again.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and then in September of this year, he had, and we were distant enough that he actually had some health issues previous that I wasn't that aware of.
Okay.
And he even came uh, to visit last August, and I didn't make the time to go see him.
Okay.
He was there visiting my brothers about an hour and a half away. And I was like, this isn't super convenient in my schedule. And I didn't, selfishly, I didn't take the time, so that's where I was. The point of that
Right.
is just like, that was kind of my boundaries of like, I'm not interested enough. I'm not in a space to sacrifice to do that.
Right.
So
Right.
really not in a great space
Right.
to do that. So then in September, he had a stroke. And, I think the siblings and so now there's not a mom in the picture, right? So it's just us. It's just kids, adult kids and a dad. Um, and so my brother and I drove down to Utah, to check in on him. And he was just really out of commission, in the
Mm.
hospital in really bad shape. And so he, just to kind of make it brief, ended up having a series of 3 different strokes. So he would just be on the road to recovery about 20 days in, and he would stroke again. And so that happened 3 times. And then after the 3rd stroke, my sister and I were there. So during that time, I also made the effort to fly down or be there at least once a month, which
All right.
felt
Which is a
doable.
lot.
Yeah. I mean, it's 10, 12 hours away. And so either a day's drive or a flight. And once a month with still kids in my home felt like I was making efforts. I wanted to be there, but, I also, not knowing what the end would be necessarily, I was trying to create a balance of like being there to support, but also, managing what needed to happen at home. And so I would go down there once a month. And then after the 3rd stroke in the hospital, just a lot of, health complications. My sister and I had to make the decision to, kind of call it. And he wasn't necessarily on life support, but, we had gotten direction that his quality of life was not going to improve. And it was really just a downward spiral. And so we were kind of at the heart of that decision. We weren't the adult kids getting to support a mother,
Right.
we were the sole caregivers and decision makers. So
And that's a very different role than if you
yeah,
were there supporting your mom or his wife.
yeah. So
And your
that
sister at this
became,
point, she had quite an estrangement from him.
yeah,
Is that
she
right?
had even more so than I did. And she's the only person that lived in close proximity to him, which is interesting because this was her worst nightmare.
Mhm.
Literally her worst nightmare, to have to be in that position. And yet she had this call to duty.
Mm.
She just knew like that she needed to be there. And so she would go in every day and spend, sometimes hours, sometimes, minutes, depending on what her schedule would allow. But she gave everything to him and advocated for him when he didn't have a voice. And I mean, her sacrifice was immense. Like, we have so much gratitude for what she did for him.
How did that?
And literally went from this space of not speaking to him for, I mean, very minimally within several years, to an everyday caregiver showing up to advocate for him at the hospital, at the rehab center, every day,
Right.
every day. And so
That's a huge change. How did that change her? And how did that care that you were giving together change that whole dynamic with your dad?
oh, she, it's the most miraculous thing. Like, she is his biggest fan. Like,
Oh,
she loves him with all her heart. Like, it's the sweetest thing. Like, she actually has like his ashes, his remains, like in her home. And her boys
wow.
put this funny little tiny sombrero on the box. And for Memorial Day, she sent us a picture. She bought some flowers and like put them in a vase behind him, you know,
Uh-huh, uh-huh.
celebrating him, memorializing him. And I'm like, this is amazing. This woman, this girl whose heart was broken by her father, you know, and his actions, and really had set up some boundaries just due to, you know, trauma and hurt, um, to, you know, being his biggest fan, like loving him with all she's got. And it just really lends to like the power of service. Like, she served him every day and gave of herself, and sacrificed her time. And, you know, she would take her family with her when she could, you know, whoever could go visit. But yeah, she and her kids and her husband just gave everything to him in a way that we couldn't because we lived far away.
Right.
And so, and, you know, the healthcare system does the best they can, but we really learned the power of having an advocate, you know, there to fight your battles for you, um, was so necessary. So we're really grateful for her.
That's really amazing. I mean, that's
Yeah.
really amazing to think of going from feeling like you have to have boundaries with someone to then being able to really have this beautiful nurtured relationship.
Yeah. And
Did,
I think that the circumstances were such a blessing. Because here's my dad, who can be a really impatient, really critical person, never complained once. And he was bedridden for 3 months and uncomfortable and in pain, and, you know, sometimes couldn't speak, and, you know, having to do this hard rehab for such minimal progress. And he never, we would kind of joke with the nurses, like, oh, how are you doing with him today? Like, anticipating, like, he's a hard one.
right.
And never once. They were always so positive. Like, he never complained once. And so I just think like the blessing of the circumstance, where all of the things, like the prideful elements of the world that influence kind of the negativity in our relationship with him, were taken away, right? Like, all of that was off the table. So I think that really allowed for my sister to show up, and it was dependent on her, right? He could not possibly impose on her life and her plans. It
Right.
was all her willingness to show up in his circumstance with kind of this clean slate of, you can't hurt me with X, Y, and Z. And so I can show up in my own way for you, and we can build from here.
That is amazing. I mean,
Yeah.
that is miraculous
Yeah.
because
Yeah.
she probably would have been so justified to say, you know what, you broke that relationship with me years ago. You know,
Yeah.
sorry,
And
good luck.
so, yeah, so many things to kind of back up that justification, right?
Right.
Yeah. So, and we've talked about this, like, if he would have gotten in a car accident, or, you know, some kind of a sudden death that didn't have this longevity component to it, it would have been a very different ending, you know.
Right. Right.
And the blessing of it is this element of peace and closure, and, um love and gratitude and recognition, like all of these things that came from the full experience.
Right.
Um,
Right.
that was such a blessing because I'm like, Heavenly Father truly blessed us with that experience so that we didn't have to live the rest of our, because we're like mid 40s and
Right.
younger,
You guys are
right?
young. Yeah.
So we didn't have to live the rest of our lives with this other view, right? Like
Right.
that was, and we've talked about this, we're like, in a way, we feel like our dad's, not that it was necessarily his choice, but there was still like, there's still sacrifice there, right? Like his life was still cut short. He was only 69. So,
Right.
in some ways still cut short so that we could live with a different sense of peace for the rest of our lives.
Right.
And now he gets to be in heaven and
And be at
experience
rest.
whatever healing and be at rest that he needs in his
Right.
life.
I mean, that, and it sounds clear from, when you were talking about your experiences with him as a child, it seems clear that he loved you, that he
Oh,
loved all of
yeah.
you, but maybe
Yeah.
he didn't have some of the skills that would have been helped him to be a more dependable dad as when you were children.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's a really beautiful thing that you were able um, to have such a great experience with him before he passed.
Yeah.
That, because I know we've talked about that before, about the, like, I think you mentioned sometime something about how, just at the time that you've just, really discovered your dad,
Yeah. He's
you've
gone.
lost him. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. And there was this moment that I hold as a really like sacred, special experience, but I feel that, maybe this is an appropriate time to share that, you know, really at the end of his life, you never know quite when those last breaths are going to be, and I shared this with you in a, closer to the time that it happened, but, where I was sitting with him on his dying bed. And once he was on hospice, and he was still living, still breathing, still there, not able to talk and communicate because of, the health elements of it. But I had this very clear overall feeling of like healing. It was a feeling of
Mm.
healing and like he's okay and he's at peace. Which you often expect that to come when after someone passes, right? Like entering more of that heavenly state. That the healing comes later. And it was such a powerful experience to me that I was like, he's still here. And the message that I'm receiving, and it was this interesting, like physical, emotional experience um, that he was healed, like that it's happened. You know,
Like his
it's not,
soul.
his soul was healed, and like he was seen already at
Wow.
that point. And I'm like, and I just kept thinking, but he's still here, And I
Right.
don't mean that like comically, but I think just because we so often, just like I said, like anticipate that to be a later opportunity, like, and for me, we may believe that when we pass to the next life, like there will be an opportunity for clarity and repentance and becoming whole with God and like this progression, element of our lives and eternal potential. And so to experience that while he was still living, breathing, and on this earth, and to have that veil of heaven open that way where I was experiencing it, and what was interesting is it made me feel very mortal and very imperfect and very alive, to where I was like, oh wait, I've spent my whole life saying he needs to change, he needs to repent, he needs to be a different person to show up for me. And suddenly I saw my own imperfections and my own flaws. And I was like, wait, like he needs my forgiveness. I didn't show up for him in his life the way that maybe I could have. Maybe
Right.
I was a piece that he needed, in
Right.
his life, and I was blocked by, circumstance and again, like
By your own pain.
by my own pain and give myself, the grace of understanding,
But
but
that
just
is
in that,
grace, isn't it? I mean,
yeah,
that's grace. That, I mean, what I'm hearing is this moment where heaven literally comes into that room and touches you both,
yeah.
right? And
And it's like this sliding door. There's that 90s movie that we love with Gwyneth Paltrow of the sliding door and circumstances change with that sliding door. But that's what it felt like. It was like this sliding door moment where he wasn't passing, but it was like he was sliding into that more heavenly space. And, that door was open. And because he was drawing closer to that, I was on this other side, still here
Mhm.
and present. And
Right.
so, and he lived for maybe a couple more hours or so after that. So it wasn't like the moment, right?
Right.
But you just realize that time frame before, it's so obvious to me now, like the heavens doors are open, like that veil is, clear, and God's angels are among us and working on our behalf, you
Right.
know, like bringing healing to those of us that are still going to be here and for those who are ready to pass on.
That's that's really that's amazing. That's beautiful. Thanks for sharing that.
Yeah, you're welcome.
So so now how has your healing been? This will be your first Father's Day without your dad,
Yeah. Yeah.
right? But
Yeah.
with almost a new dad, like a new and improved
Right. Like
dad.
Father's Day in the past was more of a like, shoot, I gotta make a call. I gotta extend, I do think like Mother's Day, Father's Day are these strange dual
Yeah,
holidays, right? When you're a parent, because you're like, wait, it's my day, but it's also my mother's day and it's also my mother-in-law's day.
right.
And how do we how do we do that? And so yeah, with a Father's Day, it's like, yeah, I'm trying to help provide a happy, positive experience for my children's father and also my own father, who I have a difficult relationship with. And so, yeah, this will be the first Father's Day with my new dad,
Yeah.
who's in heaven.
Yeah. And that's how you think of him.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. In our church, we worship and attend the temple, um, which is a different opportunity to worship than maybe our weekly church houses, for those that don't know. And I've had several experiences where I've definitely felt my dad there with me in the ordinances and ceremonies that we, participate in, and very clear. There was one day as I was driving home, that a voice as clear as day, said that I heard said to me, "You have the dad you always wanted,
Oh,
and he's with you."
I love that.
And
And
here
it
I had waited my whole life, for this ideal, what we would maybe view as an ideal scenario. Um, and it's interesting because I didn't feel at all like, well, this is not fair. You could easily go to this like, well, that's not fair. But I just knew that it was through the circumstances, and because those circumstances just feel like a gift, because I don't think without going through this loss experience that I would have that opportunity. And so instead, I just have gratitude of having this dad
right.
that I always wanted, who I feel is with me often. Um, and, I just know that he's on the other side instead.
That speaks a lot to how powerful this transformation was, because joy that you are experiencing, even with that short relationship with the dad you always wanted, seems to be so joyful that the the past opportunities that didn't happen, although it shaped a lot of, your experiences, and I'm
Mm-hmm.
sure they were painful, it sounds like the joy, like they're swallowed up by the
Yeah.
joy of what is now.
Yeah.
Does that make
Yeah.
sense? Because that's
Yeah.
what I'm hearing,
Yeah,
which I think is
definitely.
just miraculous and such a testament to the power of the principles of Christ.
Yeah. Yeah. And what I've experienced is that for those of us that were closely involved in that end process, um, have that mutual experience. And it's hard for those that weren't there to understand
Mm-hmm.
and not necessarily play catch up because maybe that's not their journey, but there was something about having that shared experience and shared view and understanding that, yeah, allows them to kind of sit in that same space with you.
So literally, the fact that you were able to be physically presently there in
Yeah,
these
made a
last.
huge difference. Yeah.
So what does your grief look like now? Do you
Um,
have triggers of emotion? Do you
yes. So
feel
what
at peace?
I definitely feel at peace. There was a time, for a while after. So he passed in December. It was right before Christmas, December 18th. And there were definitely moments of questioning and did we make the right decision? A little bit of self doubt. Um, because when you're experiencing this like new relationship through someone who's passed, you're like, well, wait, you want them back, right? You
Right,
want that new version and experience back. And so you're like, wait, could we have done something different that would have given us that? But then we have to like rely back on, no, we felt very much at peace when we got this piece of information, we made this decision. So you have to like rely back on your personal experiences to not second guess and say, no, remember, we felt so clear about that. And
right,
that's why we made that decision. And this was the reality. And if we did something different, this would then be, which would be so miserable. Right. So
right,
that was a piece of it, is just, a little bit of self-doubt and questioning, because the weight of those decisions were so heavy. But as far as triggers go, of emotion, I would say, because there's elements of like settling the estate that I have charge over, that with my sister. I have to like dive into photo albums to find, screenshots of information or whatever. And so it'll just be a picture, like a picture on my phone that, and it's interesting how it's surprising. It kind of surprises you. You're like, oh, wait, I get a pit in, like a little bit of a pit in my stomach, like,
mm-hmm.
ah. So it's like a physical feeling, that just bring tears. Um, and it's interesting because sometimes you'll sit in it for a minute and then other times you're like, I don't have time for that right now. Like
Yeah.
I have a purpose. I've got to move forward. But I'm like grateful for, I always say I'm grateful for the tears, because for a
Mm-hmm.
lot of years I would think, I don't know if I'll even cry when my dad dies, which is also like a really sickening thing to consider. And I'm like so grateful for the tears that come, because it's a full recognition of, like you said, the redemption of a relationship and, something I always longed for. And that he did too, like
Right.
he loved his kids so much. And I
Right.
would have so many people after he passed, like so many friends of his, just go on and on and on about how much he would talk about us and how much he loved us and how proud he was of us. And he would always send, cards on holidays and things, and would just praise us, praise me. And I know he did the same to my siblings, and regretfully, I'd sometimes kind of roll my eyes at it, right?
Right.
He would send
Right.
me this really sweet, uplifting card, giving nothing but compliments to me, and I would kind of brush it off.
Right.
And,
Right.
but now looking back, I'm able to go, no, he genuinely like loved and cared for me and
Right.
my kids and my family. And he was so complimentary of Kevin, my husband.
Right.
And so I realized I'm like, he did have eyes, that saw. And I think in his own heartache and heartbreak, he lost the most. We always feel like, we really got the short end of the stick in some regards. And yet I'm like, he lost a lot. And I, it took me a long time to recognize that. But I'm
Right.
like, he's the one that really lost in this. And that's so sad.
Right.
Um,
But
and, but what was sweet is just hearing, people in his neighborhood or in his community or church share all the wonderful things that he would do for other people.
mm-hmm.
He would, he was a shopper. He loved to spend money. Very much an impulse shopper, but his one friend shared a story where they were at Lowe's or Home Depot or something, and he bought like the whole cart of poinsettias, like every last plant, probably hundreds of dollars of poinsettias, but like went and delivered them to, the older sisters in his ward and neighborhood, and
Oh,
then to rest homes, like wherever, right? So
right. Right.
in these moments where his own children were too hurt and heart-hearted to have him come visit for a holiday, he would go do that.
Right.
And which I'm like so proud. It's like this double where I'm like so impressed that, he would spend his time doing something like that. And also sorrowful that we were all stuck in this middle zone of hurt and, broken relationship that like we're all loving, caring, compassionate people, but sometimes you can't get out of your own circumstance, right? To do something different or better.
Right. And I think that's understandable, right? That's part of this life experience is really complicated and messy. But what, if anything, your story, I hope, would serve as a really good encouragement to re-examine our um, our complicated relationships
Yeah.
and see if
Yeah.
there's any room. Is there any room for redemption in those relationships that we've kind of gotten used to having on the periphery?
Yeah. Yeah.
Be-
Something I shared recently in our church service was um, so the prophet of our church, Russell M. Nelson, had given a talk about being a peacemaker. And when that talk was given during our general conference, it was clear as day to me that for me, that talk was about repairing the relationship with my dad. And then 6 months later, the talk given was, so that would have been April. So then October, the talk was Think Celestial, which is
Mhm.
the basic idea of like having this larger viewpoint, right? Like
Right, that this life is not the only
this life is not the
good.
only element, the only existing point. And, um, and then shortly after that, so within, I guess, maybe we'll give it a year span, then my dad dies, right?
Mm-hmm.
So here I am just feeling the promptings from Heavenly Father to say, this is really important. Like, be a peacemaker, find peace in this relationship, like, do what you can. It won't be perfect, but, make steps towards that, right? And then
Mm-hmm.
think celestial, have a larger viewpoint, stretch your view there. And then here we are faced with this like what ended up being a 3-month time frame of reconciliation. And that first drive down to my dad, to see him, I mean, there was this moment of like panic of like, well, we're now financially, you know, responsible for him and for his care. And like, it was so encompassing. The part of us was like, gosh, I hope maybe it'll just be best if he goes quick, like
Right. Yeah.
maybe rehab isn't, like living and having his life extended isn't the best choice. And yet when we all fell into that caregiving mode, how quickly our hearts changed. So quickly that to have this like full shift in 3 months, and there were still steps, right? It wasn't, the end result wasn't at that first moment, but
Right.
within a 3-month period, we were unraveling 44 years of experience. And so how
Wow.
quickly, and so like you say, like examining the complicated relationships in our lives, like there are possibilities. And it's something I really try and think a lot about, is like getting curious about, why do I do the things I do? And why do I respond or react the way I do? And get curious about other people. Is my judgment or my assumption about who they are, or what they do, or why they react the way they do, like, is it what I really think it is, or could it be something different, right? Like, is there something different at the heart of it?
And of course, the
So,
answer to that is probably always yes, right?
yes,
Because
yes.
we just don't know the trails that other people's feet have walked, right? We don't.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. So someone may show up in the world in one particular way, and we may make an assumption as to why that is. And yet there could be something so, deep that, and not that it's deep that it's hard to unravel, but just like such a misunderstanding
Right.
of why that is. So I think, like I said, the last 10 years, I definitely feel like I was being fed inspiration points. I had a time where it was very clear to me to consider the importance of family history
Mm.
in regards to my dad and his story.
Mm.
And
How did that affect your view of your dad, understanding his background better?
oh, it was huge. It was huge. And it was while he was on his, I think it was why he and his wife were on their mission, is when it kind of struck me. And I shared it with him when he got home. We were just in his backyard visiting casually, and we were talking about something. And so I kind of brought up this theory that I had felt, essentially prompted to like consider. And it was just like the family dynamic. So kind of reevaluating what did it look like for him to be a child in his family dynamic and home and his parents, right? And could I maybe consider elements of his parents' relationship that, they're both past and gone. I can't necessarily ask them, but like what I do know of them, could I make some moderate assumptions,
Mm-hmm.
there, and kind of to shed light on this, theory. And then can I jump back another generation and look at that dynamic and just kind of go back a little, a few generations, and just consider like, who were they in the community? What was life at that time in the world like? And so as each of these people, are interacting in that world, like how does that affect the next person and the next generation, down
Right.
to my dad and
Right.
his self view, and then how did he show up and react and respond to that?
Right.
And through that process, I actually just was given the gift of a ton of compassion and consideration, where I think before that, you had asked, like, did I have judgment? Absolutely. And it just really softened my heart to the possibilities of this might be an element of the why. Why does he show up this way? Why does he react this way? Why does he seek after that?
Mm-hmm.
And again, you can't just necessarily blame one person, but just recognizing that a family dynamic and how far back can that go, and a community, and all
Right.
of those elements that feed into one person's life experience, and then more people that come in and enter that life are going to affect it in one way or another,
Right.
and then it just continues, which is thus the human experience, right?
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah. We exist in a system.
But I think considering family history and the stories that we can learn are so impactful, of just kind of unraveling a human and who they are.
I love how all of this has led you again to this redemptive point in time with your dad. And I've really, really enjoyed talking about it and hearing some more things from you about your experience. Before we finish up, can you just answer the question for me? What do you think it means to grieve well?
Hmm. I think, I it's a hard question to answer, because I've really, like, having gone through this, I've really tried to be mindful of everyone's grief experience is different, right? Every scenario is so different. Someone losing their dad could be so different than me losing my dad. And it comes down to, like, such individual little elements, right? Like, part of our dynamic was we didn't have a mom or a current wife or spouse, that changes. I was talking with a cousin of mine that I'm very close with, and her sister-in-law lost her dad very recently after. And we were saying, it's very easy to say, like, oh, this is, you just went through this. This is just like you. And yet I wanted to validate that girl's experience with, it's very different. She had, from my understanding, a long-standing loving relationship with her father, which I think is a very different grief and loss experience than mine, which was more of a estranged relationship with a grand redemption at the end.
Right.
Um, so to grieve well, I feel like, is to be able to consider your own situation as your own. What was surprising to me was the physical and emotional drain that I experienced, that things that through different hard things in life, I've been able to utilize, like, for instance, exercise. Like, I've used lots of other stress points in my life, and I use running as an outlet and something
Mm-hmm.
joyful to bring a positive element to my day. And through this, like, I could not, like, get those workout
Interesting.
clothes to get out go for a walk. Like, that was a
Right.
struggle. So kind of
Right.
that physical drain. And yet there were things I was grateful for, the time and effort and work, years of work, and in really intentional work to strengthen my relationship with God, through my worship and practice. And I know that was a huge element. And so to get up and to continue to do those things, I knew were vital for me. And so it would be really easy to say that feels hard, or I don't want to do that. Um, because to be social was hard, because people, they don't understand your personal experience. They've experienced loss in their own way, but it's really hard to emotion match with someone else. And because my experience was that my relationship with my dad was difficult, I think that someone could really easily draw upon the assumption that maybe it's not so hard. Right.
Right.
And it was surprising to me how hard it was. And again, maybe not as hard as someone else, right? Like, so we just all have such an individual experience. But what I found too that really helped, that brought me a lot of peace, was because people don't know what to say, what to do, the world goes on around you anyway, right? Like that's just going to happen. And so for me, it was very vital to invite people into my story so that they could emotion match with me. So for instance, my husband, Kevin, when I went down for my dad's third stroke, we knew he was bad, but we really didn't know to the extent or how quickly he would go. If I would have known what that experience was, I would have absolutely had my whole family travel to be there and experience that with us. But you didn't know until, moment by moment, and you just don't know. And so when I came home, I found that it was very vital for me to try and catch him up to where I was at. And so that became through storytelling. So I had to kind of retell with as much detail as possible and as much feeling as possible so that he could at least grasp where I was at.
Right.
And so, because otherwise it's like, well, you barely talked to your dad the last 20 years. Like,
right.
Get up and go to the store, which is not what he said, but just like, there's things in life that you have to carry on with. And so for me, I found the more I could share, and not to make it about me, but it just allowed me to like share my experience, but it also allowed people in. And I think when you can invite people in, then, you often just need someone to listen. I think the very common advice is like, never say, oh, I know exactly how you feel. A mistake that we all make often. Because like I said, there's so many variables to a story and experience. But you could say, I think by asking questions like, as simple as, what is this experience like for you, at this time, ... Which is hard because, and maybe that's just my personality, because I'm saying this and now I'm realizing like not everyone might be able to have the ability to invite people into their story, right? And their experience. And so for me, it was important it was over Christmas, so I had my kids and my family around, which was very nice. So we could kind of lay low. And it was also challenging because everyone else was so busy with their holiday plans. So I was very grateful for the people that made some kind of effort and outreach. And it was very surprising to see the people that showed up for you and those that didn't.
Right.
There were people that I would have thought would have made, there was really like no effort made.
Right.
And I don't mean that to be like judgmental of them. It just was like, oh, interesting. Like not even a phone call,
Right.
But the people that reached out were people that had been through some kind of experience. And some were very random, like, through a Facebook Messenger, someone that my kid went to elementary school years ago, kind of a mom from one of the classrooms type of thing.
Right.
That was like, oh, I lost my dad last year at this time,
So there's a connection there.
Some kind of connection there. And so I think, I don't know if I'm answering your question to grieve well, but I'm just sharing thoughts.
What I've heard from you is letting people in so that they can. I especially love the example you gave about letting Kevin know of as much detail as you could share with as much feeling so that he could grasp what you were experiencing and be there for you. And I think that's a great example of grieving well.
Yeah, because I picture if we kind of hold ourselves hostage in our own space and environment, then we're just going to continue to suffer and fall into a deeper hole.
Right.
I don't picture that to be, and I don't say this with judgment on anyone, but to me, it can be a very lonely space because our experiences are so unique. So for me to be able to talk to my sister who was there, or for my brother-in-law, to reach out because he was there, or for Kevin to be able to comfort me because I was able to share with him so he could emotion match with me because he wasn't there.
Right.
Or my cousins who lost their dad almost 5 years ago, I guess, who their father was like a father to me. So when he died, I thought, well, this is it. Like, this is what it's like to lose a dad. And I shed a lot of tears over the death of that uncle. And that was a hard grief because he wasn't my dad. And so when you share, my uncle passed, you don't get the sympathy and the understanding because people don't understand the depth of your relationship.
Right.
But to be able to share with my cousins who I'm very close with, they're sisters to me, and to share with them and them to just to know that they're like, oh, we've got you. We lost our dad, but even if they hadn't lost their dad, because they know me so well and they love me unconditionally and they know my story, my full story, they can sit in that space with me comfortably.
Love that. I love that idea. We'll leave on that idea of allowing people to come and sit in the space with you. Thank you, Melissa. I appreciate you sharing, and I hope that you enjoy your Father's Day as you celebrate, the wonderful guy you married who's the father of your children, but I hope that you're able to enjoy thinking about the father that you have.
Thank you. I will. And I just really find joy in knowing that he's found healing, because I think so much of what became turmoil in our lives was the hurt that he felt. And so to be able to feel and have an understanding of the joy that he's feeling and the healing that has taken place in his life, that brings a joy and happiness to mine. So I'm able to celebrate that with him without him being here physically.